In October 1913, a ship arrived at Ellis Island.
It was called the Athenae, and it had just come from Greece.
Among the passengers was a young couple named Yorgos and Andromachi Papanikolaou.
They had very little money and they didn't speak English.
They had no family or friends to meet them, no jobs awaiting them, and no place to live.
Yorgos did have a medical degree from Greece and a PhD in zoology from Germany.
But in their new country, where he would go by George, he was only able to find work selling rugs at a department store.
Andromachi, who would go by Mary, also found a job there sewing buttons.
Yet somehow, George and Mary would go on to change the world.
Within 15 years, George invented something that would save millions of lives: the Pap test.
He would also pioneer a whole new field of medicine, cytology.
The path to get there, though, was filled with obstacles.
And although the Pap test is named after George Papanikolaou, he couldn't have overcome those obstacles without the help of his colleagues, especially Mary.
She worked alongside him his whole career and never got the full credit she deserves.
So this is a story not only of Dr. Pap, but also Mrs. Pap, two immigrants whose unique partnership blazed a new frontier in cancer prevention.
In the early 20th century, cervical cancer was the most deadly cancer in the U.S., killing 40,000 women per year.
The only way to detect it was by biopsy, and by that point, it was often too late.
The world needed a way to detect cervical cancer earlier, and Dr. Papanikolaou would eventually find it.
And with his work, when it was finally accepted and used around the world, we were able to find cancer in women without them knowing they had it, saving their lives because it was found early and it was in a stage that was curable. And he's saved innumerable women, millions, whereas cancer of the cervix was the #1 killer, at least in the United States. Now it's like the 12th.
But Dr. Pap didn't start off knowing he wanted to invent a test to prevent cancer.
He was a brilliant student, graduating from med school at just 21, who loved reading Darwin and tackling hard research.
But his father didn't want him to be a researcher and tried to force George to follow in his own footsteps and become a family doctor.
But George rebelled.
And he tried to find a wife who could brave the frontier of a life of research with him.
The curator of his hometown museum, Anastasia Morou, tells a story of how George fell for Mary.
Επιστρέφει λοιπόν στην Ελλάδα και παντρεύεται την μάχη σε κάποιο περίπατο που κάνανε στην Αθήνα. Λοιπόν, ήταν μια φανταστείτε ότι τότε τα πασούμια ήταν πολύ λεπτά, ο δρόμος κακοτράχυλος. Ήταν η μοναδική από τις γυναίκες που ήταν εκεί που δεν μίλησε καθόλου.
Not long after their wedding, George served as a medic in the Balkan War of 1912, in which Greece joined forces with its neighbors to defeat the Ottoman Empire.
During the war, George met Greek-American volunteer fighters who told him if he wanted to do research, he should move to the U.S.
After the war, George and Mary took their advice.
After some months at the department store, the Papanikolaous got lucky.
A professor at Columbia had read George's dissertation from Germany, and he recommended George to a professor at Cornell Medical School, who hired George.
Soon after, he also hired Mary as a technician.
The two would spend the next 47 years working side by side.
And they made a decision together. They would not have children so they could focus on research.
George's early research was on the menstrual cycle of guinea pigs.
One day, he bought a nasal speculum from a drugstore and used it to get cell samples from the reproductive tract of guinea pigs.
That same day, he had an idea. What if he could track the same cycle in humans by studying their cell samples?
That evening, he conducted his first experiment on the only person who might let him.
And of course, the only guinea pig he had at the time was his own wife, Andromachi.
To track her cycle, George needed a sample every day, and they started a routine that would last longer than they first imagined.
My aunt, Diamantis, she was sort of a guinea pig. She would take a pap smear every single day for like 25 years. Every single day.
Mary also invited her friends to a party where she somehow convinced them to have swabs taken of their cervixes too for a smear test.
It was in studying one of these friends' samples that Dr. Pap made his greatest discovery.
He was able to tell from odd shapes in the smear that Mary's friend had cancer. He later said,
"The first observation of cancer cells in the smear of the uterine cervix was one of the most thrilling experiences of my scientific career."
It might sound strange for him to say that when Mary's friend was about to learn she had cancer, but he was thrilled because he saw how his invention might save countless lives.
In 1928, George shared his extraordinary findings at a conference.
Unfortunately, though, the medical community didn't believe in his work.
The doctors, the researchers, They were comfortable in a sense
doing the biopsies.
of doing the biopsies.
They didn't accept that he could find pathology in just looking at scattered cells as opposed to a biopsy of tissue or of a tumor. And it was because of that they didn't believe in his research data.
So it seemed like Dr. Papp had reached a dead end, which was extremely disappointing.
If the medical community didn't believe in the life-saving potential of his new screening tool, then who possibly could?
It would take another 15 years before he could convince the world of the significance of his findings, during which thousands more women would die of cervical cancer without the benefit of his test.
And if it weren't for the support of his closest colleagues, especially Mary, Dr. Papp might have given up right then.
He was thinking about, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing this anymore. I should concentrate on something else. But Tia Mahi was very insistent. And she said, no, Yorgo, because she was very emphatic like that. She said, no, Yorgo, you cannot give this up.
George also got support from a new colleague at Cornell.
In 1939, his first boss died, and his new boss, Dr. Hinsey, would be pivotal in supporting Dr. Papp's research.
One day, George told Hinsey he had just won a grant to study the effects of a hormone on muscle tissue, and Hinsey's response surprised George. As Hinsey recalled,
He was somewhat taken aback when I urged him not to take it, but instead to devote all his time to developing his cytological method for diagnosis of early cancer in the reproductive tract of women.
And Hinsey, recognizing George would need another expert on his team to persuade the medical community, teamed Dr. Papp up with Dr. Trout, a respected gynecological oncologist.
he also connected George with another crucial colleague, Hashime Murayama, a gifted illustrator who had arrived at Ellis Island from Japan 5 years before George and Mary.
Dr. Papp would rely on Murayama's artistry to show the subtle differences between normal cells and cancerous ones.
The team got right to work on what would become Dr. Papp's most groundbreaking book.
But when World War II broke out, their work almost hit another dead end.
In 1942, the Enemy Alien Hearing Board, part of the racist Japanese internment program, had Murayama imprisoned, ironically, at Ellis Island.
Without his illustrations, the team wouldn't be able to finish their book.
Knowing that time was of the essence to save women's lives, George and his colleagues fought hard for Murayama's release.
Amazingly, they convinced the Attorney General of the United States to step in and have Murayama freed. In his ruling, he said of Murayama,
He is the only person in the United States who can do that kind of work.
The team could finally get back to work together, and the next year, Dr. Papp published his most famous book, proving at last to the medical community how effective his new test was.
After 1943, the Papp test became widespread, and news of Dr. Papp spread too.
This is the doctor, George N. Papanicolo. It has been his theory that virtually no woman need ever die of cancer of the cervix if she would have a smear made twice a year.
Cervical cancer rates began to plummet and continued to fall over the next decades.
Dr. Papp next turned his sights on a new frontier, establishing the study of cells, or cytology, as its own medical field.
He basically started that whole field of medicine, and we use cytology in many other aspects of medicine, not just in gynecology. We look for the changes in lung cells, colon cells, all sorts of cells that lets us know something is wrong, and nobody ever thought of that before. He was the first one to look at cells. He was deserving of 10 Nobel Prizes.
Although Dr. Papp never received the Nobel Prize, he did receive many honors that recognize the significance of his work.
The awards and honors are usually in his name, and most headlines, banknotes, stamps, statues, busts, and other tributes feature him alone.
But he was not alone, and he himself was careful to credit Mary, such as in one award speech he gave in Greece.
But also he says he was very happy that in another event in Montreal of Canada, the newspapers wrote about him, but also about his wife.
I don't know if he could have done it without Tia Mahi.
She is the root to his success.
If I was able to accomplish anything of use, it was owing to her health and devotion.
It was an incredible relationship. Incredible relationship between two people. There was no animosity, there was no competitiveness, there was just sheer love.
The story of Dr. and Mrs. Papp and the medical frontier they blazed is at heart a love story. Their love for each other, their love of research, and their love for the millions of women whose lives they would save.
I'm a cancer survivor.
I'm a survivor.
Soy una sobreviviente.
I'm a survivor.